Hey guys, Basement Horrors here. Welcome back to the True Horror Story series. Today, Home Invasion Stories Part 2. Enjoy. Story number 1. This is my first post to Reddit, and may possibly be my last. I've never really told anyone this story, not even my parents or my wife. It happened when I was 13 years old, so some of the details are a little sketchy. I have only ever told variations of the story in fear of telling the exact truth, so this will be the first time it comes out legit. When I was 13, my friend and I had a terrible scare one night when my parents were out with some friends. My friend Jesse and I were your typical nerdy 13-year-old boys who felt more inclined to play with action figures and watch movies rather than call girls and play out in the yard. Jesse is the one friend you have growing up where you're best friends from beginning to end. We hardly see each other anymore, but we have that bond where when we do see each other, it's like no time was ever spent apart. It was a typical evening of us playing action figures, talking Star Wars, playing Star Wars Battlefront 2 way too much. My parents were going out to eat with some friends, so they ordered some Chinese food for Jesse and I. It must have been November-ish, because it was cold out and dark rather early in Michigan. My parents left probably around 5-ish, and we spent a couple hours goofing off. Around 7, we decided to eat our food. My parents' house is situated out in the country, which will be important later. Their house is one of those 80s tri-level houses, so every floor is broken up. The house basically has 1.5 basements. We were sitting in the dining room, where the south wall is basically one big glass sliding door. Jesse sat with his back towards the door, and I sat facing it across from him. We were eating our food, not really talking, when I think I hear two men speaking in our backyard. Now, this is kind of key here. It's pitch black outside, so when I would glance over to look over Jesse's shoulder, I could only see my reflection, nothing else. So, you know those moments where you think you hear or see something, but never tell the other person because they never made any type of reaction to it, so you just assume it was your imagination? Well, it was like that. But now, after confirming with Jesse some 10 years later, he was doing the same thing I was doing to him. I glanced at Jesse a couple times to see if he had ever made any type of indication hearing the men talking faintly in the background, but he didn't. Getting nervous, I half laughed and made the joke that I thought I heard someone talking outside. Jesse replied that he had heard it too. Now at this point, some alarms should have went off because the property is fenced in completely by chain link. We had 2 dogs, and lived out in the middle of the country, so it was mega unlikely anyone would be inside the fence on our property. Just as we were about to brush off the comments we made about the 2 men talking, we heard this sentence that I can still hear clearly in my head today. "They are in there." We both stopped eating at the same time. We looked at each other with horror and knew that this was not our imaginations. Again, this same male voice said, "They are in there." But then he added, "Where are the dogs?" At this point, we knew this was for real. And then we heard, "Check the doors." We quickly jumped and shut off all the lights in the house. Still not sure if that was smart or dumb, and ran down the stairs. We hid in one of my mom's closets, filled with old clothes that were never used. The closet was large enough that we could hide deep enough inside that we wouldn't be seen immediately. We hid there for a couple minutes listening, or at least it felt like only a couple minutes. But then it got worse. As we started to listen, we could hear knocking on the windows. Then we heard pounding on the doors. We looked through the crack in the closet door and saw two guys standing outside the window. Only, we could just see their legs because we were in the pseudo-basement part of the house. All the lights were off, but we could still hear them and see them relatively well. Then, one guy got on his knee and looked into the window and started licking it. He kept saying that he was hungry. One of the men had said, "I know they heard us because they shut off all the lights and ran." We were so afraid, but we kept really quiet, just wondering if they were going to try to come into the house. He tried to open the window and couldn't, so he began to punch the window frame, which made the whole house shake. I was freaking out because I had no idea where my dogs were at, how long it would take my parents to get home, and that there was no way of reaching our landline phone to call for help. We were trapped, and they knew that we were hiding from them. One guy walked off, and I could hear him pounding on the glass door. I was sure that they were going to find a way inside, and that it was only a matter of time. All of a sudden, we heard the garage door open, and our two dogs, both German Shepherds, tore out of nowhere. We heard one of the men say, the dogs are out now." The jingling of the fence let us know that they had hopped the fence. My parents came walking through the door, wondering why the lights were all turned off. We had stayed in that closet for 2 hours. Those guys looked around for that long. The story is getting way too long, but long story short, we never told my parents. The dogs were set free once the garage door had opened, which released their doggy door. My dad had rigged out to be on cue with the garage door. And what seemed like only a few minutes hiding was in reality hours long. A few weeks later, our local township sent out a notice to be aware of not picking up strangers in our area, and that there had been multiple kidnapping attempts. Whatever that means. The worst part is, that isn't even the weirdest thing to happen in our small town. I'm gonna post some videos, maybe on YouTube, about our local town murders that have never been looked into because the township is lazy and cheap. I'd love to hear the feedback. I still think about this story regularly. Edit. I'm not promoting my YouTube channel because I don't have one. It was merely just a thought. Story number 2. First post. I'm not the greatest at telling stories, so please bear with me. I'm not sure if this belongs here, since it wasn't exactly creepy, but extremely scary. When I was 14, I met a guy named James. He was 17, and I dated him for 5 years. I'm now 30. I grew up to a poor teenage mother. I never met my father till I was 20, and I made some pretty bad choices as a young lady. James was a big-time drug dealer, and at the time, I found that thrilling and so cool. It was a typical abusive relationship. He cheated on me a lot, would physically, mentally, and emotionally abuse me. He would then buy me things or give me money to make it all better. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't know any better and had poor self-esteem. His money took me away from my poor home life, so I stayed for 5 years. This happened when I was 17. James and his brother Victor bought a house in a really nice neighborhood. Victor was a single guy, the player type. He had a random girl over visiting that night, and James and I were going to bed. It was about midnight. Victor and his new girl left the house and took James' vehicle. James and I were alone in the house. About 2 minutes after Victor left, we heard a knock at the door. James gets up to open it and tells me he must have forgotten his keys. So I'm in bed, and I hear James say, "You have the wrong house, you need to fuck off." Seconds later, he comes running into the room telling me to close the door as we hear the door being kicked down. 2 men entered the house. One was wearing a bandana over his face, and the other guy I didn't recognize, but he wasn't trying to hide his identity. They started kicking down the bedroom door as we did our best to hold our weight against it. We were screaming and begging them to leave. At one point, the bandana guy got his arm and leg through the door. I made contact with him, and he dropped his sawed-off shotgun. I reached for it, and he seemed to back off a little bit. The other guy grabbed the gun. Out of fear, I couldn't recognize him, but I felt something in the stare he gave me. We thought that they were just there after drugs and money. We had no weapons. The drugs and money were in a separate bedroom, but they didn't take anything. It wasn't a robbery. They were there to give someone a beating. James was on the phone with the police this whole entire time. The guys took off. It was time to check what they took and hide the drugs. The police came, and we noticed a bullet hole in the wall in the bedroom directly beside the one we were in. I later found out it was because the bandana guy had hit the gun out of the other guy's hand as he tried to shoot me through the door. I went home the next day completely traumatized, not wanting to tell my family anything that happened, because all they do is gossip. I walked in the door, and my grandmother knew about the home invasion. My family knew James was a drug dealer, but they weren't concerned. I thought at the time, someone who James knew must have known someone in my family, since she said a female cousin told her. My cousin Anthony's wife called me saying, "Anthony wants to say sorry, but you weren't supposed to be there." Again, I was dumb and assumed someone in the thug world told them. We lived in a small city. I was so naive and was convinced it was a robbery from a rival drug dealer. That wasn't the case at all. We spent weeks waiting for them to come back. James made sure he always had a few scary guys with guns in the house. I realize now that this only added to my trauma. A few months after this happens, I'm at James' house reading the newspaper. I see my cousin Anthony and another guy in the most wanted section. The other guy looked vaguely familiar. Anthony is gang-related. We're the same age and grew up extremely close. Although, he got locked up at age 13 and has been on and off ever since. Anthony and I would write each other. We had a strong bond. The phone rings. It's a girl named Carly that is completely in love with Victor, but since he's a player, he treats her like crap. She brings up the mugshots in the paper and says, "That's your cousin, right?" She confesses to me that the home invasion was because of her. The other guy in the mugshot liked her, and she told him how Victor would slap her around and forced her to get an abortion. My cousin Anthony was his friend. They made her tell them where Victor lived, and they watched the house until they saw what they thought was me and James leaving. She was apologizing profusely, begging me not to tell James. I didn't. I knew if I told him, he would have her shot. Also, because it was my cousin, I assumed that I would get some blame or have to show James thugs my cousins lived. Regardless of what he did, I'm stupidly loyal to my family. I saw Anthony at a family function a few years later. He said sorry and that he loves me and that it wasn't his fault. And that was 13 years ago. My life is completely different now. I'm an upstanding member of society, but I still feel a lump in my throat when I talk about it. I can't go to a gun range without having a full-out panic attack. Hey guys, Basement Horrors here. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, share with your friends. Until the next scary story video, have a horrific day.